The old house in Slaughter, Louisiana, sat quietly beneath a canopy of oak trees, its weathered paint and sagging shutters blending into the sleepy rhythm of the town. On the surface, nothing about the place stood out. Neighbors passed it every day, waving at the couple who lived inside. The Fletchers, people known for polite smiles, church attendance, and an unremarkable presence in a community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. But inside those walls, behind drawn curtains and shut doors, a different reality pulsed. And at the heart of it all was Lacy. She had once been a girl who walked freely, who spoke softly, who filled her home with small gestures of life. But time had slowed for her, almost stopped, until the couch in the family's living room became not just a piece of furniture, but her entire world. Its faded cushions sagged beneath her frame, and year by year, that spot grew into a prison she could neither escape nor explain. The silence of the room was broken only by the hum of the central air and the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. Days blurred into nights, nights back into days, until the passing of time itself became difficult to grasp. For 12 long years, she remained there, confined, still, while the rest of the world carried on beyond the thin walls of her home. What made her stay? What unseen chains bound her to that couch? Some would later speculate about rare conditions, locked-in syndromes where the mind remains awake but the body refuses to move. Others whispered of fears that grew too large, anxieties that kept her anchored, unable to step across the threshold. And some could not help but wonder if cruelty silent, deliberate cruelty was at play. Whatever the truth, Lacy lived in that fragile space between existence and disappearance. Her parents insisted she chose it. They would tell people later, with calm faces, that she refused to leave the couch. That it was her decision, her preference, her way. Yet anyone who looked closer, who dared to peer beyond the words, might have seen something else. A woman shrinking, fading, her body and spirit unraveling inch by inch. The human body is not made for stillness. It demands movement, circulation, care. Without it, pressure builds, blood flow halts, skin begins to weaken. For most people, bed sores are a distant medical term. For Lacy, they became a daily torment. Small wounds at first, then deep hollows where the flesh could no longer hold itself together. Her body told a story her lips never spoke. Still, the couch remained her boundary line, the one constant in a life dissolving around her. Outside, the Fletchers smiled at neighbors and joined community gatherings. Inside, their daughter sat unmoving, unvisited, unspoken of. Even in a small town, especially in a small town, secrets can hide in plain sight. Lacy's world narrowed until even her own voice seemed to retreat. She sent a few emails, short fragments of communication that proved she still had strength enough to type, thoughts enough to share. But over time, those too became rare, fading like echoes in an empty hall. Imagine it, year after year, watching the same patch of ceiling, hearing the same footsteps in the hallway, feeling the seasons change only by the shift of air through the thin walls. To live inside that stasis is to lose the sense of where you end and where the silence begins. And still, no one outside asked questions, not loudly enough, not forcefully enough. Because in Slaughter, the Fletchers were respectable. They were ordinary. And ordinary people are rarely suspected of extraordinary neglect. But inside that living room, as weeks bled into months and months into years, something unspeakable was unfolding. The human spirit can endure much, but the body, trapped and unattended, tells no lies. Every hour she remained pressed into those cushions, her strength diminished, her frame weakened, her very skin became a map of suffering. Yet she breathed, she endured. The story of Lacy Fletcher did not begin with her death. It began in that room, on that couch, in the quiet moments when the world forgot her. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: in those endless nights, staring at the ceiling, waiting for someone to notice, what did she hope for? The sun rose and fell countless times over that quiet house, its light filtering through blinds that were rarely drawn back. Dust floated in the golden beams, settling gently on furniture that seldom moved. To anyone passing outside, life appeared calm. But within those walls, the atmosphere thickened with stillness, with a heaviness that seemed to press down on everything. Lacy remained on the couch, her existence tied to it as if by invisible chains. Her parents would walk past her, pausing only briefly. They provided her food, small portions that did little to nourish, just enough to keep her tethered to life. A portable toilet sat nearby, an unspoken symbol of the world she no longer entered. Hygiene supplies rested in the corner, mostly untouched, reminders of what care should have been but never truly was. And yet, the Fletchers believed, or at least claimed, that this was her choice, that she wanted it this way. It was easier, perhaps, for them to think that. Easier to say she preferred the couch than to acknowledge the truth. For if they admitted she could not rise, if they admitted she was wasting away before their eyes, then the weight of responsibility would fall squarely on their shoulders. The community knew the family as good, reliable, even warm. Sheila and Clay Fletcher were seen at church socials, at local events, their hands shaken, their presence welcomed. Who would have guessed that behind their front door, their daughter's world had collapsed into silence? For Lacy, silence was not empty, it was crushing. She still felt, she still thought, she still knew. Every ache in her body, every pressure point against the sagging cushions, every breath she struggled to take reminded her of what was slipping away. The human body, trapped in such confinement, begins to protest. Bedsores became her constant companions, forming like fire beneath her skin. They deepened, layer upon layer, until they were not just wounds but gaping voids. Infection seeped in, slow but relentless, spreading through her weakened system. Still, she endured. She breathed. She lived another day, and another, and another. And as she did, questions multiplied like shadows. Why had no one knocked harder? Why had no one looked closer? Why did the world outside move so freely while she remained unmoving? The answer may never be known. But what is certain is this: Lacy Fletcher's suffering did not happen overnight. It was built, piece by piece, year by year, in a home where denial reigned and silence protected those who should have cared most. 12 years is a long time. Long enough for a person to vanish from community memory. Long enough for neighbors to stop wondering, for friends to stop asking. Long enough for the couch to become not just her prison, but her grave. And yet, in the midst of this, a chilling thought lingers. Did she believe someone would come? That one day, a knock at the door, a call, a hand reaching in, would lift her back into life. If so, that knock never came. It wasn't until the end, when the silence inside the house grew too heavy to ignore, that the truth came into the light. The day authorities stepped inside, the air carried with it a stillness like no other. They entered expecting illness, perhaps neglect, but nothing could prepare them for what they found. The smell reached them, first thick, suffocating, undeniable. And then their eyes fell upon the couch. There she was. Lacy's body, fragile beyond recognition, lay collapsed into the fabric. The cushions beneath her were darkened, worn by years of confinement. Her frame was emaciated, her skin marred by wounds that had long gone untreated. The sight was more than tragic, it was incomprehensible. What shocked investigators most was not only her condition, but the fact that she had lived like this while others went about their lives around her. She had not been locked away in some hidden basement. She had been right there in the living room of her family home, visible to anyone who stepped inside. And yet no one had seen, or perhaps no one had wanted to see. Speculation erupted almost immediately. Could she have been trapped by a rare condition like locked-in syndrome? Was she fully conscious all those years, unable to move or cry out? The idea chilled even seasoned professionals. Locked-in syndrome means being fully aware, fully awake, but silenced by a body that refuses to obey. To imagine her enduring that for over a decade was horrifying beyond words. But in time, medical examination dismissed that theory. Lacy could swallow food. She could type messages on occasion. She had the ability to move, if not freely, then at least enough to show she was not completely paralyzed. The conclusion became harder to ignore. She had been physically capable of more than what her life revealed, which meant her suffering was not fate. It was neglect. Her body told the story with brutal clarity. Severe bed sores had tunneled so deep they reached to her bones. Infections spread, untreated, until her blood itself turned against her. Malnutrition gnawed at her frame, robbing her of strength day by day. By the time she was found, sepsis had claimed her. The investigators stood in that living room, absorbing the enormity of what had taken place. And with each detail, the questions deepened. How had two parents, respected and even admired in their community, allowed this to happen in plain sight? What had they told themselves each morning when they passed their daughter on the couch? How had they convinced themselves that silence and denial were enough? The answers lay buried somewhere in the minds of Sheila and Clay Fletcher, who now stood accused of something unthinkable. And yet, the echoes of the case reached beyond them, because what happened to Lacy was not just about two parents, it was about the silence of a community, the failure of a system, the fragility of a life overlooked. Her story had begun with quiet, with stillness. But now it carried a weight loud enough to shake an entire town. And still, the most haunting question lingered in every corner of that living room. In those last days, as her body weakened beyond recovery, what final thoughts passed through her mind? News of what investigators had discovered in the Fletcher home spread through Slaughter like a fire in dry grass. In a town where life moved slowly, where faces were familiar and stories rarely shocking, the details hit with the force of a storm. People who had once shaken hands with Sheila and Clay Fletcher found themselves whispering in disbelief. The same couple who attended church socials, who volunteered at community events, who smiled politely at the grocery store checkout. How could they have hidden such horror within their own living room? Neighbors replayed their memories, grasping for missed signs. Some recalled glimpses of Lacy from years past, quiet, reserved, avoiding crowds. Others realized, with a chill, that they had not seen her in over a decade. No birthday parties, no holiday visits, no friendly drop-ins. She had simply disappeared from view, and no one had asked enough questions. The town's sense of safety cracked. If such a thing could happen in the heart of their community, behind the walls of a respectable home, what else might lie hidden in plain sight? For investigators, the case demanded answers. Medical experts were called, their voices steady but their eyes heavy as they described what Lacy had endured. They explained how her bed sores had grown worse year after year, how infections festered, how maggots had been found in her wounds. And here lay one of the most unsettling paradoxes. Maggots, reviled in the public mind, sometimes save lives. In medical settings, they are used to consume dead tissue, to clean wounds too deep or stubborn for ordinary treatment. But in Lacy's case, their presence was not controlled, not healing, not medical. It was nature's desperate attempt to fight decay where no human hand had intervened. A grotesque mercy in the middle of unthinkable neglect. The autopsy revealed the official cause of death, sepsis. Her body, weakened by years of malnutrition and sores, could no longer fight the infections raging inside. Sepsis had spread through her bloodstream, shutting down her organs one by one. Yet for all the science, for all the clinical language, the truth remained visceral and inescapable. Lacy had not died suddenly. She had died slowly, over 12 long years, in a room filled with silence and denial. When the charges were announced, second-degree murder against both Sheila and Clay, the shock deepened. These were not strangers in the news from some distant city. These were neighbors, fellow congregants, friends. The courtroom doors would not only open to the accused, but to a community forced to confront what it had failed to see. And at the heart of it all, one question hung heavier than any other. Had Lacy truly chosen this fate, as her parents claimed? Or had her silence been mistaken, perhaps willfully mistaken, for consent? The answer mattered, not just to the court, but to everyone who had walked past the Fletcher home and wondered, silently, if they should have knocked. As legal proceedings began, the theories surrounding Lacy's confinement multiplied. Some argued she might have suffered from agoraphobia, an overwhelming fear of leaving the safety of home. Others suggested autism had made her world smaller, interactions harder, retreat more appealing. Still others whispered about schizophrenia, about unseen battles of the mind that could have pinned her down long before her body gave out. But none of these explanations felt complete. Autism, after all, does not condemn someone to a couch. Agoraphobia alone cannot explain flesh rotting untreated. Schizophrenia may silence, but it does not physically paralyze. To many, the puzzle remained unsolved. Experts warned against easy answers. They urged people not to use Lacy's conditions as scapegoats, not to let the word autism or anxiety become an excuse for what had been done or not done for over a decade. Mental health is complex, they said. It requires compassion, not simplification. And whatever Lacy's challenges, none of them justified the neglect that allowed her body to waste away before her parents' eyes. Inside the courtroom, Sheila and Clay Fletcher presented themselves not as monsters, but as misunderstood caregivers. They repeated their story. Lacy had chosen the couch. She had refused medical treatment. She had refused to move. They had respected her wishes. But their words rang hollow against the photographs, the autopsy reports, the expert testimonies. Respecting a choice is one thing. Allowing someone to decay alive is another. The law drew its line here. Second-degree murder meant the state believed the Fletchers had shown extreme indifference to human life. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a willful disregard. And still, the courtroom was not the only arena where judgment was passed. Online forums lit up with outrage, comment sections filled with disbelief and anger. Strangers from far beyond Louisiana spoke of Lacy's case as if she were their own neighbor, their own kin. The sorrow was shared, amplified by the horror of her silence. Yet beyond the noise, one truth cut deeper than all the others. Lacy's story was not just about her parents' choices. It was about a system that had not intervened, a community that had not asked, a society that had allowed her to fade into invisibility. And so, even as the trial prepared to move forward, the weight of her story lingered far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Because in the end, it was not only about how Lacy had died. It was about how she had lived, or rather, how she had been left to wither away in a world that should have seen her. And with every passing day, another question grew harder to ignore. If this could happen to Lacy, who else might be out there, unseen, unheard, silently waiting for someone to notice? The courtroom lights glared brightly against polished wood, reflecting the weight of a story almost too heavy to tell. Lawyers spoke in measured tones, presenting evidence piece by piece. Yet the images they described were vivid enough to burn into the mind of anyone listening. The photographs of Lacy's condition were not easily forgotten. Jurors looked down, some wincing, others swallowing hard as medical experts explained what years of immobility had done to her body. The human form, they said, is designed for movement. Muscles wither without use. Blood flow stagnates. Skin, pressed constantly against one surface, breaks down. What begins as redness becomes an open wound. What begins as a sore becomes a cavern. For most patients, bed sores can be treated, shift the body, clean the wound, provide care. But left unattended, they deepen until bone itself is exposed. That had happened to Lacy. Her pain, unmedicated, would have been relentless. Every breath is a reminder of the flesh breaking beneath her. And yet, through all of this, she had remained alive, breathing, enduring, waiting. The prosecution painted a picture not of parents trapped by circumstance, but of parents who turned their faces away. They emphasized the paradox of the Fletchers' public life, outgoing, involved, respected, while their daughter wasted away in their own living room. Defense attorneys countered, their voices firm, portraying Sheila and Clay as overwhelmed caregivers. They spoke of Lacy's reclusive nature, of her refusals, of the impossible task of forcing a grown woman to do what she did not want. They asked jurors to see not malice, but tragedy. But the more the details emerged, the more difficult that plea became. The portable toilet beside the couch, the untouched hygiene supplies, the absence of any medical record for more than a decade. These were not signs of respect. They were signs of abandonment. And so, the trial moved forward, each side locked in a battle not just over facts, but over meaning. Was this murder, or was it neglect misunderstood? Beyond the courtroom, the story had already escaped into the wider world. News outlets repeated the details with grim fascination. Talk shows debated caregiver responsibility and mental health stigma. On social media, the name Lacy Fletcher became a symbol of society's blind spots, the people who fall through the cracks, unseen until it is too late. But beneath all the noise, one question continued to echo. What had Lacy thought in those final days? Staring at the ceiling, listening to the footsteps of the very people who were supposed to protect her? The story of Lacy Fletcher did not only reveal horror, it forced uncomfortable reflection. Because hidden in her suffering were lessons about what neglect looks like, how silence can shield cruelty, and how communities sometimes choose not to see. Neighbors replayed their memories, searching for signs they had ignored. They remembered Sheila's cheerful small talk at gatherings, Clay's steady handshake at town events. They remembered never once being invited into the Fletcher home. And they remembered, with dawning unease, that no one had asked where Lacy was. In small towns, privacy is often respected. People keep to their own business. But privacy, in this case, had become a mask. And behind that mask, Lacy disappeared. Experts stepped forward to explain the broader context. They spoke of autism and how being on the spectrum can make social interactions overwhelming. They spoke of anxiety disorders, phobias, and the ways the mind can build prisons just as real as walls. They spoke of how trauma and fear can erode a person's will until leaving the couch might truly feel impossible. But they also reminded the public that none of these conditions condemn someone to death. With support, with therapy, with medical care, with love, people thrive. Autism is not a sentence. Anxiety is not a life of confinement. The tragedy was not that Lacy was autistic. The tragedy was that she had been left alone with her struggles until they consumed her. Her story became a mirror. How many families, overwhelmed by caregiving, slip into denial rather than seek help? How many communities fail to notice the invisible suffering in their midst? How many people are living quietly in situations no one dares to question? For the people of Slaughter, the reckoning was sharp. The Fletchers had been their own, their friends, their fellow churchgoers. If they could harbor such darkness behind polite smiles, what else might be hidden in other homes? And yet, amid the horror, something else stirred. A determination. People began talking more openly about mental health, about caregiver burden, about the importance of checking in on one another. The case, as grotesque as it was, had forced conversations long avoided. Still, the weight of Lacy's absence lingered like a shadow. She would never walk again, never speak, never reclaim the life that had been stolen from her piece by piece. And so, as the trial pressed on and the community searched for answers, one question remained, echoing louder than all the rest. If the world could forget Lacy for 12 years, who else was being forgotten right now? Public outrage swelled like a rising tide. The story of Lacy Fletcher was no longer confined to the small town of Slaughter. It had traveled far beyond Louisiana. Carried by headlines, talk shows, and endless streams of online commentary. On social media, strangers wept for her. Posts spread with photographs of the house, captions filled with disbelief. How could this happen? How could no one stop it? Forums ignited with debates. Some people called for the harshest punishment possible, while others tried to imagine the crushing psychological weight of 12 years on a couch. But outrage is rarely simple. In the noise of countless voices, nuances were lost. Some fixated on Lacy's autism, using it as a simplistic explanation for her fate. Others blamed her entirely, insisting she must have refused help. But those who looked closer saw something more complex, a tragedy born of silence, neglect, and a failure to intervene. Medical voices joined the conversation, seeking to ground the chaos in truth. They explained the science of immobility, how flesh breaks down under constant pressure, how infections spread through weakened tissue, how malnutrition magnifies every injury. They described sepsis in grim detail, the body's immune system overwhelmed, organs shutting down, life draining away. And then came the detail that unsettled even the most hardened readers: the maggots. In horror stories, maggots symbolize rot, death, decay. Yet in hospitals, they sometimes play the role of healer, eating only dead tissue, leaving the living flesh untouched, saving patients from infections that would otherwise claim them. For Lacy, the presence of maggots revealed two truths at once. First, that her wounds had been left untended long enough for nature itself to intervene. And second, that even as her body decayed, those tiny creatures may have delayed the inevitable, buying her more days of suffering, but also more days of life. It was a paradox so haunting it caught fire online. Were the maggots villains or her last protectors? No answer brought comfort. And as people scrolled through news feeds, shaking their heads, one thought kept returning: if this could happen for 12 years without discovery, how many others were hidden right now behind curtains, in silence, waiting for someone to notice? While the world debated, the small town of Slaughter faced its own reckoning. For decades, the Fletchers had been part of the fabric of the community, quiet, polite, dependable. They attended Sunday services, waved at neighbors, volunteered when called upon. Their lives seemed ordinary, respectable, safe, and yet, behind their front door, something unimaginable had taken place. For townspeople, it was not only the horror of Lacy's condition that shocked them, it was the betrayal. They had trusted the Fletchers, shared meals with them, prayed beside them. To learn that their daughter had been wasting away in the same home shattered that trust in ways words could not mend. Some residents grew defensive, insisting they could not have known. Others carried guilt, whispering that perhaps they had noticed Lacy's absence, but had chosen not to ask questions too deeply. Because in small towns, questions can feel like intrusions, and politeness often wins over suspicion. But in this case, politeness had been deadly. The paradox became unavoidable. The very people seen as pillars of their community were now accused of murder by neglect. And if appearances could be so deceiving here, where else might they be hiding the same? The courtroom became a mirror, reflecting not just the actions of Sheila and Clay Fletcher, but the blind spots of an entire society. The case was not just about one woman on a couch. It was about every invisible person, every overlooked life, every time silence had been chosen over confrontation. And through it all, one haunting image remained: Lacy, staring at the ceiling, day after day, while her parents carried on with their public lives. Did she ever hope someone from outside would come through the door? Did she hear the sounds of laughter, of engines on the street, of neighbors chatting, and wonder why none of them remembered her? The answer will never be known. But the weight of that question, unanswerable and yet inescapable, is what now haunted Slaughter and beyond it, the world. The trial moved forward, but outside the courthouse, conversations shifted towards something deeper than guilt or innocence. People began asking not just what happened, but why. Lacy's autism became a focal point, misunderstood by many, oversimplified by others. Some claimed it explained everything: her silence, her retreat, her immobility. But experts pushed back firmly. Autism, they reminded the public, is a spectrum. Many on it live full, vibrant lives, pursuing careers, raising families, exploring passions. It is not a sentence to isolation, nor a reason for neglect. Yes, Lacy had challenges. She struggled with social anxiety, found comfort in routines, avoided crowds. These traits were real, but they did not explain the couch. They did not explain the untreated wounds, the absence of medical care, the years of silence. The danger lay in using her diagnosis as a shield for those responsible. To blame autism alone was to erase her humanity and to excuse the inexcusable. Instead, experts urged compassion and nuance. They spoke of how anxiety can magnify until leaving a room feels impossible, how depression can sap willpower until even basic tasks seem insurmountable. They spoke of trauma, of fear, of the ways invisible battles can lock a person into stasis even while their body remains capable of movement. But they also emphasized this: with care, with therapy, with medical support, with patience, people break free from those invisible prisons. They do not wither away on couches, unnoticed, for over a decade. For jurors and the public alike, the message was clear. Mental health challenges may have shaped Lacy's struggles, but they did not write her ending. The choices of those around her did. And yet, as the evidence mounted, another layer of tragedy emerged: the quiet suffering of caregivers. Because when caregivers feel trapped, when resentment festers, when denial replaces honesty, the results can be devastating. Was this what had happened in the Fletcher home? Had Sheila and Clay, overwhelmed or unwilling, slowly turned away until their daughter's suffering became background noise? The courtroom wrestled with facts. The world wrestled with questions. And beneath them all lay one haunting truth: Lacy's silence had been filled with meaning. The couch was not just furniture, it was a monument to years of neglect, a silent testimony no one could ignore anymore. As proceedings continued, the psychological toll on both Lacy and her parents became a subject of fierce debate. For Lacy, the torment was clear. Imagine the mind awake, conscious, aware, while the body wastes away. Imagine wounds burning with every shift, infections coursing silently beneath the skin. Imagine the weight of knowing help was a few feet away, yet never truly given. Her suffering had not only been physical, it had been psychological, emotional, spiritual. But what of her parents? Some argued that Sheila and Clay must have lived in denial, convincing themselves each day that their daughter had chosen this path. To acknowledge the truth would have meant acknowledging their role, and so they looked away, building a fragile wall of justification. Others suggested resentment, that years of caregiving without support had curdled into neglect, that their presence in the community gave them cover to live double lives. Still others insisted their actions could not be rationalized. Caregiving is hard, yes, but love, duty, and basic humanity demand at least the bare minimum: medical attention, nourishment, dignity, none of which Lacy had received. As the jury listened, the broader world continued to debate. Was this a case of overwhelmed parents or of cruelty? Was this misunderstanding or murder? The law would decide. But society had already reached its verdict. What happened to Lacy Fletcher was not just a tragedy. It was a warning. Because behind every polite smile, every quiet home, every curtain drawn tight, another story might be unfolding. One the world won't see until it's too late. And the question no one could escape was this: how many more Lacys exist right now in silence? The courtroom fell into a tense rhythm. Each day brought new testimony, each witness adding another thread to the tangled tapestry of Lacy's story. Medical experts described the horrors of prolonged immobility bed sores deep enough to expose bone. Infections that creep silently into the bloodstream until every breath becomes a battle. Their words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Even seasoned court reporters found themselves averting their eyes from photographs projected on screens, images too raw, too painful, yet necessary to confront. Sheila and Clay sat stone-faced, their lawyers insisting on their narrative, that Lacy had chosen her fate, that they respected her autonomy, that intervention would have been a violation of her will. But the arguments grew weaker with every detail unveiled. Outside the courthouse, Slaughter, Louisiana, was no longer quiet. National media vans lined the streets. Commentators dissected the trial in real time, social feeds flooded with outrage and disbelief. Neighbors who once waved politely at the Fletchers now spoke of betrayal, of trust shattered. How had such horrors grown in the heart of their small town without anyone seeing? The town itself felt split. Some whispered of shame, desperate to move on. Others called for accountability, not only for the parents, but for a community that never asked questions. And beneath it all lay the nagging dread: if it happened here, could it happen anywhere? The courtroom became a crucible, burning away excuses, forcing everyone, jury, town, and country alike to confront the cost of silence. But with the fire came another question. Would justice be enough to heal what had been broken? As the trial edged toward its climax, attention shifted from the past to the future. What did justice look like for Lacy Fletcher? Was it a prison sentence for her parents? Was it a verdict shouted in headlines? Or was it something harder, something society itself had to carry forward? Legal experts debated on television. Some argued for the harshest penalties possible, second-degree murder with decades behind bars. Others suggested that negligence, though devastating, was not the same as malice. But every argument circled back to one undeniable truth. A woman had been left to waste away in her own home for 12 years. And so the jury deliberated. Inside the room, silence reigned except for hushed voices weighing evidence against conscience. One juror stared at the photo of the couch, its fabric permanently stained, and whispered, "How do you call this anything but murder?" Another hesitated, torn between empathy for exhausted parents and outrage at their inaction. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the community gathered in restless anticipation. Reporters held microphones ready. Strangers left flowers at the courthouse steps, not for the parents on trial, but for Lacy herself, a silent memorial for a life unseen. When the jury returned, hearts pounded. All eyes turned to the foreperson who stood with the verdict in hand. The room held its breath. And in that fragile pause, before the words were spoken, the weight of 12 years pressed down on everyone present. What the jury would say next had the power not only to decide guilt, but to define how the world remembered Lacy Fletcher. The foreperson's voice trembled slightly as the courtroom leaned forward. On the charge of second-degree murder guilty. The words struck like a bell, echoing in the silent chamber. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some clutched hands to mouths, others whispered prayers, while Sheila and Clay remained frozen in their seats. Their lawyers exchanged quick, tense glances, already calculating appeals. The judge's gavel fell once, sharp and final. The decision was made. Outside, the news broke instantly. Crowds erupted in shouts of approval, while others stood quietly, processing the gravity of the moment. For many, it was not celebration but vindication, a recognition that what happened to Lacy Fletcher could not be brushed aside as mere tragedy. It was a crime. And yet, The verdict raised more questions than it answered. Would prison sentences restore dignity to a life so long denied it? Would accountability ease the haunting image of a woman lost to neglect? For the jurors, the weight was personal. They had seen the photographs, heard the testimony, walked the corridors of horror in their minds. Now, their decision was etched in law. But justice is not a single word spoken in court. It is a path forward. And as the gavel's echo faded, the question lingered. What would that path look like for the family, for the town, for all who had been forced to confront the unthinkable? The days after the verdict felt surreal. Reporters packed up their vans. The courthouse steps emptied, and yet the story refused to fade. Editorials poured across newspapers and screens, dissecting every angle. Commentators debated parental duty, caregiver burnout, and the thin line between negligence and cruelty. Medical professionals spoke of the dangers of ignoring mental health, of how conditions like anxiety, depression, and autism demand understanding, not excuses. In Slaughter, the neighbors who once looked away now struggled with guilt. Could someone have knocked on the door, asked harder questions, broken through the silence? Many wondered how much responsibility belonged not just to two parents, but to a community that prided itself on closeness, yet never saw, or chose not to see, what unfolded inside that house. Meanwhile, the house itself stood still. The couch remained, a grotesque relic of what had transpired. Its stained cushions and torn fabric whispered of 12 years of silence, of a life lived unseen. For investigators, it was evidence. For the town, it was a scar. But for the world, it was something else entirely, a warning. Because every statistic about neglect, every headline about abuse, carried the same hidden danger. Behind them were real people, unseen, unheard, until it was too late. And as night fell on Slaughter, one final truth settled over the town like mist. Justice had spoken, but the silence Lacy endured was not hers alone. It was everyone's. As the trial faded into history, the deeper story began to take shape, not one of punishment, but of lessons. Mental health advocates stepped forward, urging society to look past the sensational details and into the quiet gaps where neglect grows. They spoke of the need for stronger safety nets, better community awareness, and resources for caregivers who feel trapped by responsibility. They reminded the world that conditions like autism, anxiety, and depression do not erase humanity. They demand compassion. Doctors explained how simple interventions could have spared Lacy's suffering: regular checkups, therapy, mobility exercises, proper nutrition. None of it required miracles, just vigilance and care. Legal scholars debated what line separates neglect from murder. Was intent necessary, or was willful blindness enough? The Fletcher case, they argued, would shape how future courts judged caregiver responsibility, sharpening laws long blurred by excuses. But beyond experts and academics, the story carried a quieter message, one that rippled through living rooms, families, and friendships. People began checking in on loved ones they hadn't spoken to in months. Neighbors knocked on doors they had once passed by. Communities whispered a promise: never again. And yet, the haunting question remained: how many others, unseen and unheard, still waited in silence for someone to notice? The legacy of Lacy Fletcher was not written on a headstone, nor confined to court transcripts. It lived in the voices of those who told her story, in the reforms sparked by outrage, in the uncomfortable conversations about duty, love, and neglect. For some, she became a symbol of systemic failure. For others, a reminder of the fragility of human dignity. But for everyone who learned her name, she was a call to action. Her couch was gone, the house emptied, but the image remained etched in memory, a monument not to despair, but to vigilance. Because silence had been her prison, but remembrance could be her release. And so, the story closed not with certainty, but with a challenge. When the curtains are drawn and the world looks away, who will ask the questions that need asking? Who will notice the silences that hide suffering? Who will step forward before it is too late? In the stillness of those questions, Lacy's voice echoed at last not through words, but through the weight of her story. A voice the world could no longer ignore.